boy's lips had gone gray by noon. Not pale, not dry. Gray, the color of old ash, the color of something already half dead. Ruth Calloway pressed 2 fingers against her son's neck and counted. His pulse was there, but it stuttered like a bad telegraph wire. Weak. Skipping. She pulled her hand away and stared at the wet ring her fingers left on his skin. He was sweating, but the sweat had no salt smell to it. That scared her more than anything else had scared her in 41 years of hard living. "Stay down," she said. Not soft, not tender, the way you speak to a horse that's fixing to bolt. Eli was 14, big for his age, long through the shoulder, with his father's jaw and her father's stubbornness. He had drunk from the seep pool 3 hours ago. So had she, but less. She'd gotten 1 swallow down before she caught the smell. Faint and metallic, like old pennies left in standing rain. She spat it out. Eli had already swallowed, had drunk twice while she was scanning the ridgeline above Tres Cruces Canyon with her field glasses, watching the dust column that had been following them since before dawn. The seep pool sat in a crack of salmon-colored sandstone, no bigger than a wash basin. It had looked clean. It had looked cold. In the Sonoran in July, a pool like that was the kind of thing a man would weep at. But the rock around its edges wore a pale yellow crust, sulfur and something worse, something she had no name for, and the ground around it held no animal tracks. Not one. No quail. No javelina marks in the red dust. No lizard scrape. Nothing had drunk from it and lived to leave a print. She had figured that out 20 minutes too late, but now she worked fast. She unknotted the neckerchief from around her throat, cotton, sweat-soaked, the color of old brick, and folded it 4 times into a thick square. She uncorked the tin canteen and tilted what was left of their good water, the water from Painted Rock Station 2 days back, over the cloth and wrung it into Eli's mouth. Not enough to flood him, just enough to thin what was sitting in his gut. He gagged. She kept pouring. He grabbed her wrist with both hands and tried to push her off, but he was weak, and she was not. "Swallow it," she said. "All of it." He swallowed. The canteen was empty now, bone dry, and the nearest water she trusted was the Gila River, 7 miles south through open desert that offered nothing between here and there except barrel cactus, loose shale, and whoever was riding that dust column behind them. Ruth stood up and glassed the ridgeline again. The dust was closer. She counted the shape of it. Not a single rider raising that much. 3 horses, maybe 4, moving at a canter, not pushing hard because they didn't need to. They knew where she was going. The Gila was the only water for 40 miles in any direction. You didn't need to be a tracker to figure out where a woman and a sick boy would run. She had ridden out of Wickenburg with a leather satchel full of survey documents, land grant records, water rights deeds, the kind of paperwork that turned desert into money. They belonged to her. They had belonged to her husband before a fever took him in March, and to his father before that. 3 generations of Calloway sweat pressed between those pages. A man named Doyle Pruett had been trying to get his hands on them for 8 months, first with lawyers, then with a fist through her kitchen window at 2 in the morning, and now, apparently, with riders. She had left Wickenburg before sunup on a gray mare named Soot, with Eli behind her in the saddle and the satchel buckled against her ribs under her coat. She had planned to reach the land office in Yuma. She had planned a lot of things. The mare was dead. That was the first thing that had gone wrong. The mare had stepped into a caliche hole 6 miles north of Tres Cruces Canyon in the dark, before first light, and gone down hard. Left foreleg snapped clean. Ruth had put 1 round from the Colt into the animal's skull, and pulled their gear off her in under 4 minutes. 1 canteen, 1 rifle, a .44-40 Winchester, a 7 pounds fully loaded, worn brass butt plate, and a crack in the stock she'd wrapped with saddle leather and baling wire. A bedroll, hardtack wrapped in brown paper, a folding knife with a 4-inch blade. The satchel. They had walked since then. 7 miles on foot in July in the Sonoran Desert is not a walk. It is a negotiation with dying, and the terms get worse every hour. Ruth Calloway was not a small woman. She stood 5 feet 8 in her boots, and she had spent 20 years working a ranch in the Hassayampa Valley, which meant her hands were like leather and her back didn't quit. But she was carrying the Winchester, the satchel, the bedroll, and now most of Eli's weight as he leaned against her left side and tried to keep his legs moving. The sun hammered the top of her hat with the kind of heat that felt personal, and the ground was pale orange and cracked in hexagons like old skin. Saguaro stood every 100 yards or so, 30 feet high, arms up like men surrendering. They gave no shade. Eli retched twice without stopping walking. She kept her arm around his ribs and held him upright. "I'm okay," he said. He was not okay. "I know," she said. The canyon walls had dropped away behind them, and the land had opened into a wide bajada, a sloping plain of gravel and creosote that ran south toward the Gila's green thread, barely visible through the heat shimmer as a darker line against the pale distance. The river looked close. Distance lied out here. Everything lied. The heat bent the horizon and made the far bank wobble like something seen through bad glass. She stopped walking. Eli stopped with her. She turned and looked back north, and the dust column was not a dust column anymore. She could see horses. She could see the glint of something metallic, a rifle barrel, a belt buckle, catching the sun. 4 riders, riding in no particular hurry. One of them had a led horse on a rope, which meant they had a spare mount, which meant they had planned for a long chase. Pruett, or Pruett's men, which was the same thing. Ruth did the arithmetic in her head. 7 miles per hour on horseback at a canter. She and Eli were moving at maybe 1 mile per hour in this heat. With the boy sick, the riders were 2 miles back. She had roughly 20 minutes before they closed the gap. The Gila was still at least 4 miles out. There was no cover, not a bluff, not a wash, not a stand of mesquite big enough to hide a dog behind. She looked at Eli, but he had one hand pressed flat against his stomach. His face had gone from gray to a strange, greenish white, and he was breathing through his nose in a controlled, deliberate way, the way you breathe when you are trying very hard not to be sick again. "Can you run?" she asked. He looked at her. He was 14 years old, and he had his father's jaw, and he said, "Yeah." She did not say good. She did not say brave boy or any such thing. She took his arm, and she ran. The Winchester slapped her back at every stride. The satchel's buckle dug into her ribs. The gravel shifted under her boots, and her left ankle turned twice on loose rock, and both times she caught herself and kept going. Eli ran beside her with his arms swinging wrong, too wide, compensating for the nausea, but his legs kept moving. They moved together. As the creosote bushes blurred past at knee height, releasing that sharp, resinous smell, the smell of desert rain that wasn't coming, and the heat pushed down from above and radiated up from the ground until they were running through a column of it, baked from both directions. Behind them, she heard the hoofbeats change rhythm. The riders had seen them. The canter broke into a gallop. Ruth Calloway tightened her grip on her son's arm and did not look back. They hit the wash at full run and nearly went over the edge. Ruth caught Eli by the back of his collar and yanked him sideways, her boots sliding in the loose gravel at the lip of a 10-foot drop into a dry arroyo. The cut bank crumbled under her left heel, and she went down on one knee, hard, and felt the skin open up through her trouser leg. No time for it. She pulled Eli down into the arroyo after her, and they dropped together, landing in coarse sand that swallowed their ankles. The walls rose on both sides, 6 feet of red clay and sandstone, carved out by water that hadn't run here in months. It wasn't cover. It was a trap if they stayed too long. But it bought them 60 seconds of invisibility, and 60 seconds was what she needed to think. She pressed her back against the north wall and listened. The hoofbeats were still coming, not slowing. She could feel them now through the soles of her boots, a faint percussion in the packed earth beneath the sand. 4 horses at a gallop and closing fast. She guessed a mile, maybe less. The arroyo ran east to west. If she followed it west, it would eventually dogleg south toward the Gila, but eventually could mean a mile, or it could mean 4. And she didn't know this ground well enough to bet Eli's life on eventually. Eli was crouched against the opposite wall, both palms flat on his thighs, breathing hard. The greenish color had not left his face. She watched him and calculated. The poison in the seep pool, whatever it was. Sulfur compound, arsenic leaching through the rock, some combination she had no chemistry to name, was still working through him. She had made him drink the last of the clean water to thin it, but thin it was not flush it. His body was fighting something she couldn't see, and she couldn't stop to let him rest. She pulled the Winchester from her back and checked the action. She had 11 rounds in the rifle and 4 loose in her coat pocket. 15 total. 4 riders, and she did not know if they had men she couldn't see. Of flankers riding wide through the creosote, which is what she would do if she were hunting someone across open Bajada. She assumed they did. She was not going to assume anything generous about Doyle Pruett's men today. She looked at Eli. "Up," she said. He stood without argument. That scared her too. Eli always had an argument. They moved west along the arroyo floor, fast walking, not running. Running in sand pulls at your legs like wet concrete and burns out your energy in half the time. She had learned that the hard way 20 years back, chasing a bull through a flooded creek bottom, and that lesson had cost her nothing but wind. She was not going to waste the lesson now. She kept one hand on the arroyo wall as they moved, feeling the clay, feeling for any change in the ground that might signal a cut or a tributary wash running south. She found it 300 yards along, a narrow slot barely shoulder wide, slanting south-southwest through a fold in the rock. Old water had polished the sandstone walls smooth and carved the floor into a series of shallow steps, each one dropping maybe 4 inches, the whole channel running downhill at a gentle grade. Water found the lowest ground. Always. If this slot ran downhill, it ran toward the Gila. She went in first. The walls closed to within a foot of each shoulder, and the light dropped to a dim orange. It smelled like old wet rock and something faintly animal. A den smell. The smell of something that sheltered here in cooler months. She moved her eyes across the floor before she moved her feet. Diamondbacks liked slots like this. The shade, the retained warmth in the rock at night. She saw nothing, but she watched every step. Eli came in behind her, sideways through the narrowest section, his breathing loud and echoey in the confined space. Above the lip of the arroyo, somewhere to the north, she heard the hoofbeats stop. That was worse than hearing them continue. Moving men were locatable. Still, men were thinking men, and thinking men in Pruett's employ had probably done this kind of work before. She heard a voice, one word, too muffled to make out, then silence. Then the creak of saddle leather, the sound of someone dismounting. They were on foot now, which meant they had found the arroyo edge and were reading the tracks she and Eli had left in the loose gravel. She pushed Eli ahead of her through the slot. "Move," she breathed. "Don't stop." The slot ran for maybe 200 yards and then opened, suddenly and completely, onto a wide gravel bar at the edge of the Gila River. The Gila in July was not the Gila of spring. Spring, she ran coffee brown and quick, bank to bank, 40 feet wide. July had pulled her down to a green, slow-moving channel maybe 15 feet across, with broad gravel bars on both sides and a fringe of cottonwood and salt cedar that lined the far bank. The water looked clean. It looked cold. Compared to everything that had surrounded them for the past 6 hours, it looked like salvation. Eli walked straight toward it. "Stop," Ruth said. He stopped. He turned and looked at her with the flat, exhausted eyes of a boy who has run out of reserves and is running on something thinner than will. "Ma, I need water." "I know." She was already moving past him, down to the water's edge, crouching. She scooped a handful and smelled it. Then she looked upstream. 20 yards north, where the gravel bar narrowed, there was a dark stain on the rock shelf above the waterline. Rust-colored, but wrong. Too orange, too bright. She looked at the gravel in the shallows. The stones near the bank had a pale coating, thin as tissue paper, the color of old mustard. She knew that color. She had seen it once before at a spring near Skull Valley that had killed 2 of her neighbor's cattle in an afternoon. The Gila was running bad here. Not as bad as the seep pool, but bad enough. She stood up and pressed one hand flat against her forehead and looked upstream and downstream. The contamination had a source, some mineral seep or an old worked-over prospect hole upstream bleeding into the river. Clean water would be downstream, past where the dilution had done its work, or it would be in the cottonwood roots on the far bank, where a secondary spring sometimes ran in a shaded gravel bed. She had seen that configuration before, too, in the Hasayampa Valley. You had to know what to look for. Eli was on his knees in the gravel behind her. She turned. He had not gone to the water. He had gone down on his knees because his legs had given out, and he was holding himself up with both hands braced in the hot gravel, head hanging, and she could see from 20 feet away that he was shaking. A fine, continuous tremor, starting in his arms and running up through his shoulders. The poison was deeper in him than she had thought. Ruth Calloway crossed to her son in 4 strides and put one hand on the back of his neck. His skin was burning, not the heat of the sun, the heat of a body fighting something internal. But she felt his pulse again at his jaw. Fast now. Too fast. The skipping she had felt earlier was gone, replaced by something rapid and shallow that told her his body had moved from sick to critical and was working without enough clean fluid to run itself properly. She had to get clean water into him in the next hour. If she didn't, the desert and Pruett's poison well would finish what 4 armed riders couldn't. She pulled him upright. "Lean on me." He leaned. She got the satchel strap cinched tight across her chest, got the Winchester slung, got Eli's arm over her shoulders, and started moving downstream along the gravel bar. The cottonwoods on the far bank threw thin strips of shade across the water. The gravel shifted and rolled underfoot. She could not move fast. She moved anyway. Her left knee, the one she'd opened on the arroyo lip, had stiffened in the heat, and every stride pulled the wound tight and sent a bright line of pain up into her hip. She did not adjust her pace for it. Behind her, not in the slot, but above the arroyo to the north, she heard something that made her stop walking for exactly 1 second. The flat, hard crack of a boot on stone. Then another. Close. They had found the slot, and they were coming through it. She looked downstream. 100 yards, maybe 150. A bend in the river where the cottonwoods thickened on both banks, and a shelf of dark volcanic rock jutted into the current, forcing the channel to narrow and quicken. Where the current quickened over clean rock, the water ran cleaner, and in the shadow of that rock shelf she could see, or thought she could see, through the shimmer, the dark, wet mark of a seep running out of the cliff face into the river's edge. Fresh water. Groundwater. Clean. 150 yards with a sick boy on her arm, and 4 men coming out of a slot canyon behind her. She tightened her grip on Eli's wrist. She did not pray. She had tried that with her husband and gotten nothing back. Instead, she counted her steps and watched the volcanic rock shelf get closer, yard by yard, in the hard white light of a Sonoran July afternoon. The cottonwood leaves rattled in a dry, hot breath of wind off the desert. Somewhere above the tree line, a Harris's hawk circled without moving its wings, riding a thermal up into the pale sky, watching everything below with the calm patience of something that never had to run. Ruth ran. But she reached the volcanic shelf with 40 seconds to spare. The seep was real. It ran from a crack in the dark rock face, no thicker than a finger, cold and clean, sheeting down the stone into a natural cup of pooled gravel at the river's edge. No yellow crust, no orange stain. The gravel beneath it was dark and wet and smelled like nothing. The smell of water that had no argument with the ground it came from. She cupped her hands and let it fill, then pressed them against Eli's mouth. He drank. She refilled. He drank again. 3 times. 4. His hands came up and gripped her wrists, and he pulled the water toward him, and she let him, watching his throat work, watching his color. It did not change immediately. It would not. But she had bought him time, and time was the only currency that mattered now. She heard the men hit the gravel bar behind her, 100 yards back. She didn't look. She was already moving. The volcanic shelf jutted 8 feet out over the river channel, and the space beneath it was a low, shadowed alcove, 3 feet of clearance, dark, the floor a bed of smooth, wet stone. She pushed Eli under first, flat on his stomach, then slid in beside him with the Winchester pulled in tight. The current churned against the rock face 6 inches from her boots, loud enough to cover the sound of their breathing. She could see the gravel bar through a 6-inch gap at the shelf's edge. 4 men. She had been right. They walked the bar slowly, rifles up, reading the ground. The lead man was thick through the chest, wearing a canvas duster despite the heat. Pruett's foreman. She had seen him once outside the land office in Wickenburg, standing with his thumbs in his belt, like a man who had never been told no. He crouched at the water's edge 20 yards out and touched the wet gravel where her boots had pressed. He looked downstream. He looked directly at the shelf. Ruth put her cheek against the Winchester stock and set the front sight on the gap. She did not fire. She waited. The foreman stood, said something low to the man beside him. That man shook his head. They had lost the track where the current had washed the gravel clean, and the shadow under the shelf read as empty from a distance. The foreman looked upstream, then south across the river, then back north toward the Slot Canyon. He made his decision in 30 seconds, and he made the wrong one. He waved his men north, back toward the horses, but back toward the trail that ran east to Maricopa Wells. They believed she had crossed the river. She had not crossed the river. Ruth stayed under that shelf for 2 hours without moving. She counted Eli's pulse every 20 minutes. By the second hour, it had slowed to something steadier. The gray had left his lips. He slept with his cheek on his forearm and breathed long and even, and she watched the gap of light at the shelf's edge and listened to the Gila run past and did not sleep. When the sun dropped behind the canyon rim, she pulled Eli out, got him upright, got the satchel on her back and the rifle in her hands. They walked south along the river in the cooling dark. She kept the water on her left and the ridge on her right, and she did not stop. The land office in Yuma opened at 8 in the morning. She intended to be there. Yet if Ruth and Eli's story pulled you in, hit the like button. It tells us to keep these stories coming. Subscribe to Wild West Survival Tales so you never miss the next character fighting to stay alive on the frontier. Drop a comment below. When Ruth slid under that volcanic shelf with her sick boy and an empty canteen, and chose to wait in the dark rather than run, what did that moment say to you about what a mother is willing to endure to get her son to morning? Because on this channel, the next survivor is already waiting.